Okay, so before we can begin to talk about our modern constitution, our current constitution in the United States, we have to talk about how we got to this point and what ideas led to the creation of the Constitution. So, the first thing that we must talk about is why the American colonists, the 13 colonies, decided to break from Great Britain in the first place to form their new government. And that all began with the Revolutionary War, and we can see the influences on our current constitution in these events. So, before tensions arose with the colonists in Great Britain, um, they had a relationship that was formed off this idea of salutary neglect. So, salutary neglect is the idea of Parliament in Great Britain and the monarchy just leaving the colonists alone and letting them do whatever they wanted, um, and just not really bugging them. So the colonists could form their own government, they could have a say in what they wanted to do, and the Parliament just kind of sat back and said, "You do your own thing." So this idea um, went on great from William and Mary during the Glorious Revolution all the way up into the French and Indian War. But once the French and Indian War hit, we see problems arise. So the French and Indian War was a war on the global scale, but in North America it was focused on Great Britain versus France, with like France having allies in the Native Americans. But it was a fight about territory. So France wanted to develop territory in the Ohio River Valley, and Great Britain didn't like that, so they fought in a war, and Great Britain ended up winning, and so France had to give up all their territory in North America. So even though this was a British victory, wars cost a lot of money, and so this caused problems for Great Britain. They were in a lot of debt, and they had to figure out how they were going to pay off all this debt. So they decided, well, the colonists, we were protecting them during this time. I think that it's fair if they help to pay off some of the debt since we were giving them protection. So this is the beginning of all the colonists' grievances against Parliament and the monarchy. So the first thing that we see is the Sugar Act in 1764. So, like I said, Great Britain decided, I think it'd be fair if the colonists pay for some of the war debt, because we did help them, we did protect them from the French and the Native Americans. So they enacted a tax on sugar in the colonies. And then they did the same thing with with the Stamp Act. So on all published papers in the colonies, there had to be an official stamp from Great Britain, and the stamp was taxed. And so these first two acts, we see that the British are kind of asserting their authority over the colonists for the first time, and the colonists don't like it because they've known this idea of salutary neglect their whole lives, and they just don't understand, so they get upset. The next thing that we see is the Quartering Acts, where Great Britain decided that it would be cheaper if British soldiers who were overseas in North America just lived with American colonists for free, and the American colonists had to provide them with food and housing, and it would save the British government money on having to pay for them to live somewhere together. And obviously the colonists didn't like this because they didn't have a say. They're like, why do we have to quarter soldiers if we don't even want them here? Because they thought that they could take care of themselves. So these first three acts, we see a lot of tensions, and we see the idea arising of representation. And so these colonists were upset, not because they were being taxed and because these things were happening, but because they didn't have a say in it. So this is after the time of the Enlightenment, where we see all these ideas starting to begin about natural rights and being born with the idea where you can make your own government. So these colonists are saying that, if you're going to do these things to us, we at least should give consent as we are being governed, so we should have representation in Parliament. But Parliament didn't see that as a problem, and they were like, no. So then we see it kind of kick up a notch after this with the Townshend Acts. The Townshend Acts were similar to the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act. They were just a bunch of taxes on a lot of imported goods into the colonies. And this leads to the Boston Massacre because colonists are getting upset about it, and there was a lot of miscommunication. And so a soldier in the British Army ends up firing, and 5 colonists get killed. And after this, we see the Tea Act. And the Tea Act was where Great Britain decided that only one company was allowed to sell tea to the 13 colonies, and that was the East Indies Company. So since it was a monopoly, there was no longer competition. They could sell their tea at any price they wanted because nobody else was there to sell it at a lower price and provide competition. So American colonists were paying about double the amount for tea that they had been. And so this led to the Boston Tea Party, where a bunch of Bostonians dumped 300 crates of tea into the Boston Harbor as kind of a jab at Parliament for this act. And this is when Parliament really lays down the law, because they're upset, and so they punish the colonists for this with the Chorus of Acts, or as they're known by Americans, the Intolerable Acts. And it was about 5 acts, but there are 3 ones that are important. The biggest one being the Boston Port Act, where they closed down the Boston Harbor indefinitely as punishment for the Boston Tea Party. And then the Massachusetts Government Act and the Administration of Justice Act pretty much protected British soldiers and also gave the right to appoint council members to governors who were appointed by Parliament. And it took away colonists' freedom to choose who represented them. So they didn't have representation in Parliament over in Great Britain, and now they no longer could have a say in who represented them in local government. So all of these problems developed with the idea of no taxation without representation, which I'm sure you've all heard before, but it's the idea of consent of the governed for what was happening to them, and they didn't have this, and so that is why there was all these grievances. So this led to what is considered the shot heard around the world and the beginning of the Revolutionary War, which is the Battle of Lexington and Concord. So this sparked the Revolutionary War and started it. And so after this, we see the Declaration of Independence. So a bunch of men in the 13 colonies met together called the Continental Congress, and they asked the question, what do we do about this problem with Great Britain? And they decided that nothing was working, and so the only solution was that they had to become independent from Great Britain and form their own country. So July 4th, 1776, Congress signed the Declaration of Independence, which was mainly written by Thomas Jefferson, and sent it off to King George and said that we are no longer colonies of Great Britain and we are our own government. We are our own country called the United States of America. But we see some very important ideas shown in the Declaration of Independence that were influences on our current government. So one of the most famous lines in the Declaration of Independence was, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal." So this was kind of a way to rally and unify all of the colonies under the Declaration of Independence by showing equality and by stating that we had all these liberties that we are born with. So, like it says, we are given unalienable rights endowed by our Creator when we are born. So the idea that we have these rights to decide how we are governed. And we have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And these can't be taken away. And so they listed out all their grievances to King George, and they said, "You have done these things to us, therefore, we decided that we are going to be independent because that is our right." So then, after they send this off, this is when the war really kicks in, and British are like, no, we are keeping you, and so fighting happens. So you can see there's a lot of battles that go on, and we have the Battle of Saratoga in the painting here, as well as Valley Forge. And while all this is going on, all this battling is going on, we still have the Continental Congress, and they are sitting there saying, okay, we are our own country now. We have to figure out how to govern ourselves. So they decide to make the Articles of Confederation. So the Articles of Confederation was adopted by Congress in 1777, but it wasn't actually ratified until 1781 by the end of the war, towards the end of the war. So the Articles of Confederation was based mainly off the ideas that were shown in the Declaration of Independence. So because of all the bad things that had happened to the colonists, they wanted to create a government that was as far away as the monarchy as they could think of. So they decided to create a government that was based on revolutionary principles of individual liberties and freedom from government. So the Articles of Confederation created a government where they had one small central government that really didn't have any power. It had delegates from each of the states, but they couldn't do anything, and they couldn't print money, they couldn't form an army. And so mainly all of the rights lied in the states. So this was the first official form of government in the United States, and it was ratified in 1781 and began taking place, and there were obviously some problems in it, but that we will get into later. So the end of the war came with the Battle of Yorktown. So Washington's army and a fleet of French ships, because the French had provided us aid in this war against their rivals, Great Britain, surrounded General Cornwallis and his army to the point where Cornwallis had to surrender. So in 1781, the British surrendered, and then in 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed, and Great Britain acknowledged American independence for the first time. So, yay! The United States is officially its own country. And so you see the Articles of Confederation develop, but as King George says in Hamilton, what comes next? Obviously, there are some problems with the Articles of Confederation because that's not our current government. We have the Constitution. But if you watch the next video, you can see all the problems that happen with the Articles of Confederation.